What is the biggest historical lie that many people believe? Story 1. George Washington's dentures were not made of wood, but rather a combination of teeth from slaves, ivory, hippopotamus, walrus and/or elephant, animal teeth, and metals. Story 2. That Napoleon was this abnormally short man. He was 5'6", which was pretty average back then. I'm pretty sure it was this smear campaign of sorts that painted him as this weirdly short, unpowerful guy. Story 3. That the Battle of Thermopylae was fought by just 300 Spartans against the Persian army. Those Spartans were joined a few thousand other assorted Greek forces. Answer. The myth also criminally tosses away why those 300 Spartans were celebrated by the Greeks and Romans. The 300 Spartans decided to die in a rearguard action, partially to save those other 1,000 Greeks. Yes, I admit, that's likely another myth too. But even if self-sacrifice for Hellas was not the rank and file goal, it certainly was what the Spartan state chose to say during its later tussle with Athens and Thebes. For 100 years, Sparta claimed it fought for the rest of the Greeks, and for 100 years many other Greeks believed them. There likely was a kernel of truth to the eulogizing. Story 4. That ancient Rome was a gleaming white marble city. For one, the marble was mostly painted with all sorts of bright colors, including the statues. Secondly, most people didn't live in marble buildings, but instead in a mixture of brick wooden structures. There's a reason Rome burnt down. Story 5. While Paul Revere is often credited with being the sole rider to warn the colonies of the British, he was actually one of 5 riders who alerted colonists on the night of April 18th. Revere's mission relied on secrecy, and he didn't shout, "The British are coming," as the phrase would have been confusing to locals who still considered themselves British. Instead, Revere's network of riders, signal guns, and church bells effectively spread the alarm. Story 6. The pyramids weren't built by slaves. The working conditions were tough, but graffiti and records show that they were usually farmers who were paid and had access to medical stands as well as food shops around. My favorite finding was the notes about rivalries and teams they were sorted into. They set goals and had team meetings and teased each other while working by writing dirty jokes and pictures. Pyramid builders were also buried with nicer things than everyday people or slaves, so that shows their profession was respected. Story 7. Violence never solved anything. Violence actually solves tons of things, and the underlying threat of violence even more so. Answer. Kyle. That's because there is no goo, Mr. Cruz. You see, I learned something today. Throughout this whole ordeal, we've all wanted to show things that we weren't allowed to show, but it wasn't because of some magic goo. It was because of the magical power of threatening people with violence. That's obviously the only true power. If there's anything we've all learned, it's that terrorizing people works. Jesus. That's right. Don't you see, Gingers? If you don't want to be made fun of anymore, all you need are guns and bombs to get people to stop. Santa. That's right, friends. All you need to do is instill fear and be willing to hurt people, and you can get whatever you want. The only true power is violence. Stan. Yeah. Story 8. The myth that Titanic was in any way badly designed, badly built, or badly operated by the standards of the time. In fact, there are so many crazy inaccuracies surrounding Titanic that it's hard to list them all here, but I'll give it a go. She was an incredibly seaworthy ship, probably more so than any passenger ship around today. The iceberg damage stretched almost a third of the way down her side, and she still stayed afloat for more than 2 hours. In that time, all but 2 of her lifeboats were launched. There wasn't time to launch any more. She could have had 100 more lifeboats. on board, but that wouldn't have helped without vastly more crew to operate them. Titanic's passengers genuinely did believe that she was practically unsinkable. When the time came to begin loading the lifeboats, many thought they would be safer staying on Titanic. There wasn't time for the crew to wait around convincing more people to get in, so when a lifeboat was ready, if there was no one else waiting to get in, it had to go. This is why so many of Titanic's lifeboats left only half full. It's not just because the crew were worried about overfilling them. Titanic wasn't traveling too fast for the conditions by the standards of practice around at the time. Further precautions were put into practice after the incident, but no one on board can be blamed for doing what anyone on any ship would have done the same. Titanic was by no means a fast ship, nor was she ever intended to be. The White Star Line, Titanic's owners, were in competition with one other big shipping line, Cunard. Cunard's liners, Mauretania, Lusitania, and later Aquitania, were the fastest in the business. To combat this, instead of fighting for speed, White Star decided to try to make their liners the most luxurious in the world. Olympic and Titanic were famed for their splendor and comfort. Passengers said that it was easy to forget that you were at sea, as there were very few vibrations from the engines, and the ships remained stable even in fairly rough seas. By comparison, Cunard's liners were very fast, but their quadruple screw configuration made vibration more apparent. It's a myth that Titanic was ever trying to make record-breaking speed across the Atlantic. She wasn't built using substandard materials. This rumor goes around a lot these days because of an article that was written some time ago. What the article is supposed to mean is that there is much better quality steel available today. This was not the case in 1909. Additionally, Titanic's builders were paid on a fee plus materials basis. They were given a set fee to construct the ship, plus the cost of all materials used. There was no incentive to use anything but the best steel they could get their hands on. The shipyard had an excellent reputation and would not risk tainting it by using bad steel, which could easily be noticed on inspection anyway. Titanic and her two sister ships, Olympic and Britannic, were also surprisingly maneuverable for their size, much more so than was expected. Some will tell you that Titanic's rudder was too small, but this simply isn't true. In fact, Olympic's wartime captain marveled at her maneuverability and was even able to throw her into a sudden turn, ramming and sinking a German U-boat. Olympic was the first of only 2 merchant vessels throughout the First World War recorded to have sunk an enemy vessel. While it's true that the lookout's binoculars were misplaced, or rather locked away in a cabinet that no one on board had the key to open, this made no difference to Titanic's fate. The images of sea captains and pirates scanning the horizon through telescopes, while common in films, has virtually no stead in reality. Binoculars and telescopes narrow your field of vision down to a fine point, making it harder to spot anything. Lookouts on real ships will use their eyes alone to search for objects of interest, and once they've been spotted, will use a set of binoculars to further inspect it. Titanic's lookouts would not have been using their binoculars to search for iceberg, even if they'd had them. Third-class passengers were never trapped below decks. The big metal gates you might remember from the film never even existed. The only time passengers were kept below decks was near the beginning of the disaster, when the officers needed time to prepare the lifeboats. First and second-class passengers were allowed on deck, but as there were so many more third-class passengers, the crowd was asked to stay below for a short while until the officers were ready to start loading lifeboats. No one was ever locked up. In fact, a higher percentage of third-class males survived the sinking than second-class males. Titanic was the largest ship in the world, but not by much. Her older sister, Olympic, was identical in almost every way. A few changes to Titanic's layout including the covering up of some promenade decks, making them count as interior space, made her technically larger, but both ships were almost exactly the same length, breadth, and height. Olympic had a GRT, gross registered tonnage, of 45,324 gross registered tons. Titanic's GRT was some 1,000 tons greater. After the disaster, Olympic received a refit, after which her GRT was up to about 30 more than Titanic's had been. But Titanic's younger sister, Britannic, which was launched after the disaster and had been modified during construction as a result of it, was about 2 feet wider than her sisters and had a GRT more than 2,000 tons greater than Titanic's. White Star Line's owner, Bruce Ismay, likely had nothing to do with the incident. Another myth popularized by the film is that Ismay had convinced Captain Smith to sail faster and try to get to New York in record time. He's also portrayed as a bumbling idiot and sneaks onto a lifeboat when the officers aren't looking. Smith. It's incredibly unlikely. Smith was looking to retire after commanding Titanic, had an extremely good reputation, and was a much-loved public figure. Passengers scrambled to sail on a ship under his command. He is unlikely to have been swayed to make rash decisions based on Ismay's need for Titanic to make headlines. Ismay himself played an active role during the sinking, helping passengers into lifeboats and doing what he could where possible. One officer recalled telling him to get out of the way, as he was making a nuisance of himself by getting involved, but testified that he was trying to help. Ismay stepped into an empty spot on one of the last boats to leave the ship, just as it was preparing to lower. He didn't take anyone else's space. Unfortunately, the media needed a scapegoat, and he was the highest-ranking official to survive the disaster. He adopted a secluded lifestyle after the disaster, funding several naval charities but otherwise staying out of the public eye. Higher watertight compartments or compartments sealed at the top would not have saved the ship. Most people could tell you that Titanic sunk because the weight of the water in the foremost. Watertight compartments pulled the bow down, allowing the water to spill over the top into more compartments and so on throughout the ship. But had Titanic's watertight bulkhead walls run all the way to the top deck, she might actually have sunk faster. With so much water contained in the front third of the vessel, she would have begun to tilt forwards much earlier and possibly have broken in two sooner than she did. Sealing the tops of the bulkheads to prevent water from spilling over was actually illegal, and still is today. The International SOLAS, Safety of Life at Sea regulations state that no civil, non-military vessel can have any obstruction above watertight compartments that could impede a passenger's escape. The bottom line is that Titanic was damaged beyond her specifications and was doomed from the moment she hit the iceberg. Full astern. There's a belief, popularized again by the film, that Titanic's engines were thrown full astern on sighting the iceberg and that this may have hindered her ability to turn away from it. This rumor started because of evidence given by the fourth officer, who wasn't even on the bridge at the time of the collision. The only survivor who was present was the quartermaster, but from his position in the wheelhouse, he couldn't see the commands sent to the engine room on the bridge telegraphs. Survivors from the engine room and the boiler rooms attested that the command was stop rather than astern. Whoever you choose to believe when you think about the time scale, it really makes very little difference. There was less than 40 seconds between the iceberg sighting and the collision, and in that time the lookouts had to ring the bell, pick up the phone, wait for 6th Officer Moody to enter the wheelhouse and answer it and alert him to the iceberg. Then Moody relayed that order to the most senior officer on the bridge, First Officer Murdoch. Murdoch ordered the turn to port, then crossed to the telegraph to send the order to stop. Try acting that out in real time and work out how long the engineers had to act on the stop order. Not long enough. There's a really good article explaining exactly what went on in the engine rooms here. This goes into a lot more detail than I can, and comes to the same conclusions. Long story short, there wasn't even enough time to stop the engines, let alone put them in reverse. Slowing down or keeping full ahead would have had no difference, as the turning circle stays the same. Leaving the starboard engine running may have turned Titanic's bow away from the iceberg, but it would have made it more difficult to keep the stern away. And please, please don't mention the Olympic switch conspiracy. Edit copied. Answer. Adding to this, the SS Californian. When I was a kid, it was mentioned quite often that the Californian could have saved everyone had they received the distress signal. The basis for this comes from the inquiries right after the disaster. The Californian was somewhere between 8 and 20 miles from the Titanic. We don't know exactly. The Titanic crew thought it was 8 miles, but determining distance under the conditions they had that night probably deceived them. It was probably closer to 18-20 miles away. The first distress call went out at 12:15 a.m., or roughly 2 hours and 5 minutes before the ship went under. The Californian had a top speed of 13 knots, or roughly 15 mph. So right away you're thinking they could have done it and arrived with maybe 45 minutes to spare before the Titanic went under. Except, the Californian would have to relay the message to the captain, reconfirm the position, crew notified and roused, boilers warmed up, the ship turned, anything else. All of this takes time. I can't give an exact number, but it would have taken time. But that isn't the biggest problem. Between the Titanic and the Californian was an ice field. We know from the testimony of the Carpathia that they almost hit an iceberg racing towards the Titanic. We don't know what the captain of the Californian would have done, but he probably would have focused on keeping his own ship safe over racing through an ice field that he had already deemed unsafe to travel through earlier. But let's say he goes full speed and they manage to do all the pre-work listed above in 15 minutes. This leaves them with 30 minutes to spare. Now what? Captain ain't parking his ship next to the Titanic. It takes time to unload the lifeboats in the water and get them back to the Titanic. And at this point, the situation is getting dire. Best case scenario is maybe they could have thrown cargo nets over the side of their ship and got people to climb up and maybe pluck people out of the water. Maybe. There was another reappraisal of the original inquiry and information in 1992, which came to basically the same conclusion. The Californian probably couldn't have improved the situation outside of maybe getting a few extra people out of the water in a best-case scenario. But here is the thing. The Californian did come sail to the Titanic's location in the morning with daylight, and it still took them 2 hours. Story 9. That the Nazis were disliked and opposed for their treatment of Jews from the beginning. There has been plenty of narrative building through the years around the idea that the Allies were seeking justice for the Jewish peoples from the start. It was only when we witnessed the extent of the Holocaust that the villainy of the Nazis became more of a widely recognized, acknowledged trope. Anti-Semitism was very common in the West prior to WW2, and the Holocaust got that far, in part because nobody wanted to house Jewish refugees. Answer. The part of American history during the 1920s and the 1930s that no one wants to talk about is that following a global conflict and an economic crash, Americans were perfectly content to remain isolated, so much so that nationalist movements started gaining more popularity following the National Socialists winning the most seats in the German government. Their anti-Judaism views were very well known, and a lot of people over here, sadly, sympathized with them. When the Second World War began, while we were supplying Great Britain and her allies, we didn't want to get involved in another war in Europe. It needs to be taught that we probably would have remained sympathetic to Nazi Germany if Japan hadn't bombed Pearl Harbor and Hitler declared war on us the following day. Story 10. People used to believe the world was flat. In elementary school, I was taught that no one wanted to fund Columbus' voyage because they thought he'd just sail off the end of the world. Utter nonsense. Since at least ancient Greece, it was believed the world was a sphere. I mean, you look up at the sky at night, see nothing but other round bodies. It makes sense you'd assume that you're on a round body as well. Answer. You can tell that the Earth is round by watching a ship sailing off the coast. The fact that objects at distance over a flat surface disappear from the bottom up tells you that they're passing over a curved surface. In fact, by knowing how tall a ship is, you can use how far it can go before it disappears over the horizon to tell the circumference of the curve the ship is traveling over. So not only did people know that the Earth was round from long before Columbus, they also knew roughly how large it was. Columbus just didn't believe the circumference of the Earth was that big. So believed you could sail from Europe to India with the provisions in a ship. He was wrong about the circumference and would have died at sea if he hadn't run into a landmass he didn't know and didn't predict was there. Story 11. I'm always surprised how many people believe the moon landing was faked. Maybe that's not a historical lie, more of a dumb conspiracy theory around a historical event. But it's way, way, way too common. There's literally amateur radio operators who were listening to the signals as they were transmitted from the moon. You would have needed every major world government and every ham radio nerd on Earth in on the fake. Story 12. That women stayed home and only men worked. For the poor, which was the vast majority of people throughout history, everybody worked that could work, even the kids. If you didn't, the whole family would starve and die. You were working your own land, working your lord's land, working as itinerant laborers. If you weren't doing physical work, you were cooking, and you were spinning, constantly spinning and weaving and sewing. Constant work. Women worked down mines, worked as servants. They were working in factories as soon as there were even proto-factories. Wealthy women also worked. They ran the households. For a wealthy family, this could be 100 people she was in charge of organizing supplies, that food was cooked, that they had accommodations, food stores. She made the medicines and tended the ill. He had men to run the estates, and the harvested were gathered by the poor men and women mentioned earlier as part of their rent. And those harvests went to her and her staff to store, use, distribute. Women have always worked. How the hell do they think the lords could confidently ride off to war and know that everything was being looked after while they were away fighting for years on? End. Story 13. That the woman who scalded herself with McDonald's coffee was an idiot and is the reason frivolous lawsuits now exist. In reality, it was a massive PR spin by McDonald's. Originally, all she wanted was cover for her medical bills. As her burns were so extensive and included her labia fusing to her thigh, the judge decided to award her more monetary compensation as McDonald's had a habit of serving their coffee at ridiculous temperatures that had led to numerous injuries prior to hers. Story 14. That the good guys always win in the end. We are the product of a back and forth, including many times the most violent, defeated, kinder, gentler people with better ideas. Wish it weren't so, but it be. Story 15. That my Native American ancestors weren't fierce warriors fighting their neighbors over land and food, way before the Europeans showed up with firearms and disease. Story 16. Not the biggest, but Ferdinand Magellan did not circumnavigate the globe. He planned the journey and set sail with the team of ships and 200-some crew members, but he was eliminated when they got to the Philippines. I think it was only 18 crew members that made it back to Spain. Story 17. People lie about the Holocaust all the time, and it's just as disgusting as what Alex Jones did by telling his listeners that a school shooting was fake. Story 18. That MLK was socially acceptable to white people during the 1960s, and not in favor of radically changing the socio-economic order of the USA. He was a socialist who was widely reviled by the white culture of the time. He's been reimagined by white people as someone willing to accept slow electoral solutions to racial problems. Story 19. Christopher Columbus discovered America. Bro literally got lost looking for India and stumbled into a continent with millions of people already living there. Answer. I find it just plain bizarre how defensive some people are over Columbus. An Italian explorer working for Spain centuries before the US was formed, or even before the 13 colonies were, who never set one foot in any land that would become part of the 50 states. And yet you'd think he was important to US history as Lincoln, the way some people will die on his hill. Story 20. That Marie Antoinette said, "Let them eat cake." That Rome fell in 476 ACE. That Constantine converted to Christianity when he saw a cross in the sky. Story 21. The Holocaust didn't happen. Seriously, it's genuinely shocking how many people simply deny that it happened. Story 22. That Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Scholarly consensus is that they were written anonymously decades after Jesus, passing by second-hand sources. Answer. Does anybody seriously think that? I've had my share of Bible study classes and always been explicitly told that A. We don't know who really wrote them, and the names are just what's traditionally attached to them, and B. Of course, they were written decades after Jesus' passing, and are in fact probably some of the last books in the NT to be written. Story 23. Lost cause ideology in the history of the memory of the American Civil War. It's still fooling people in 2025. Story 24. That Thomas Edison invented the light bulb. He did not. 18 other men pioneered it before him. Look it up. Story 25. That the Maginot Line failed because the Germans went around it. That was the point. To force the Germans into Belgium, where the French would concentrate their armies and link up with both the British and Belgians. Story 26. That the Great Pyramids were built by slaves. Archaeological evidence, like the discovery of the workers' village and tombs, shows they were built by paid, respected Egyptian laborers. They had a good diet, medical care, and were buried with honor near the pyramids they built. Story 27. Nazis were socialists. The Nazi Party was nominally a socialist party, which was a plan by Hitler to steal the support out from under communist and socialist political opponents and appeal to the labor class. But their brand of nationalistic fascism, rigid adherence to hierarchy, and corporatization of industry is the complete polar opposite to any socialist ideals. Answer. The claim that the Nazis were a socialist party often comes up. It's really quite simple. Hitler effectively took over a small party active in Munich at the time, the Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, DAP, German Workers' Party. This was both nationalist, racist, anti-Semitic, as well as socialist. I would argue that nationalism, racism, anti-Semitism are incompatible with socialism, but we've obviously just had a bit of a thing about that. Part of what was behind the issue was just this toxic historical association. Apparently, Hitler was the 55th member to join, so it wasn't exactly